Don't fuck up the culture.
This podcast is brought to you by Archimed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Archimed.
And I'm Caroline Squattrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us. On this episode, we will discuss what happens when culture goes wrong and take a look at some real-world examples. Helping us answer our questions will be two guests, Julie Manning Magid, Executive and Academic Director of the Randall L. Tobias Center for Leadership Excellence at Indiana University, and we'll also be joined by Amy Friedlander Hoffman, the former head of business development at Uber.
Caroline, what's the question of the day?
Today, Greg, we are going to answer what happens when you screw culture up.
Yeah, hopefully that question is just academic for us. I believe the consequences of allowing a culture to degrade and break are just about catastrophic. And from what I've read and understood, it's exponentially more difficult and time-consuming to fix a broken culture than it is just to nurture it all along the way on the front end. And we talked about the interplay between doing the right thing and also the business side of things, and that both are incentives to take care of culture. But on the business side, culture failures can destroy enterprise value quicker than product failures or even market failures, and they're doubly hard to come back from. And I think of, there's lots of examples, but I think about Uber, which was a pretty high-profile meltdown. There was a lot of investigations. They had to hire former Attorney General Eric Holder to help fix the problems there. And, the culture there seemed to prioritize work over everything else. And in a prior episode, we talked about the different types of culture, and we decided that ours is one that seeks more balance. Maybe they don't have the no asshole rule also. But they also disrupted an industry, and you need to have your nose to the grindstone to do that. I don't know. This will be a tough discussion because it'll take some balance between having your nose to the grindstone and that aspect of the culture, also with the sort of no asshole rule. Oh, what do you think, Caroline?
I think that culture plays a big role in all aspects of business. And if people aren't moving in the same direction, if they're not seeing leadership, walking the walk, as we talked about last episode, that can cause a lot of, discontentment within your workforce. It sounds like they also had a very competitive workforce, which I don't think is inherently a bad thing, but maybe it got a little bit out of control. So Greg, I think the big question now is, it sounds like they brought in a lot of help. They analyzed their issue. Were they able to fix the problem? Can you fix a problem like this?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it might be fun to get a inside scoop of sorts from someone who lived it. So we're going to be able to talk to Amy Friedlander Hoffman, the former head of business development at Uber, and get her take on all this, and see what she thinks about whether Uber ever had a no asshole rule, or whether they had one but it turned into not being an asshole to competitors, and then maybe that bled into being an asshole no matter who you're dealing with, even if it's a colleague. And maybe they were fine with assholes as long as they were incredibly high performing. So let's bring in Amy, see what she has to say. Amy, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
So first, I want to start by saying this is not a hit job. I'm an Uber user, and admittedly, after reading about Uber's travails over the periods of time as they led up to their IPO and thereafter, at that moment in history, I did not follow it closely. So I've sort of learned about Uber's journey through the journey we're taking on this podcast. But I wanted to visit with you, Amy, as a former Uber employee, a senior Uber employee, about your take on essentially whether there is a good or a bad culture, or whether a culture is broken if it's hyper competitive internally. Really, just what your take is on all of that, and whether you saw opportunities for Uber's culture to be improved or not.
Sure. That's a, a lot of different parts in one. You know, whether talking about good or bad culture, I would say, Uber had a lot of parts of both. Things that were absolutely unbelievable when it came to culture, and things that could absolutely be improved. Um, when we started, I was there for 5 years, from middle of 2014 to middle of 2019. So kind of when I think we had about 70 cities when I started, and over 700 when I left. Employee wise, we had about 900 employees when I started, and about 28,000 when I left. So maintaining and creating corporate culture, along the way, when you grow 300 people a week every week for, 3-4 years straight, can be a challenge.
We've all read about what maybe people wouldn't like about the Uber culture, but let's start with what you thought was really strong.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that's been challenging for me, even over the years. As you've read, there were a lot of, the headlines that, the clickbait headlines, right, or the headlines that worked. Even the positive articles were framed in a negative manner for a while. And it was really, as being someone who worked there for such a long period of time, felt like a disservice to the company. I have never worked with smarter, more passionate, and more effective people in my life. The teams. It was so striking when I went there. I had spent many years at AT&T as well, helping them build their television service, Uverse, and their broadband products. And going to Uber, I would kid with my husband that it was like, you were going from the minors to the major leagues. The intelligence, the drive, the ability to execute was like nothing I had ever seen before. And everyone's feeling that one of our corporate values that ended up coming out, which still holds true as a corporate value at Uber today, was the idea of being an owner, not a renter. That you are responsible for everything that you did, that the buck stopped with you, no matter what that job was, whether you were a senior executive, whether you were an engineer, whether you were in HR. It did not matter, but that was your responsibility, and that you needed to own and take responsibility for your job and all of your actions. So, we had the ability to execute on, whether that was campaigns, whether that was getting drivers onboarded, or kind of demand for riders, in a way that I've never seen another company be able to operate, and that was truly incredible. I would say the same thing with respect to the passion for the mission. Whenever we would sort of do surveys, and the belief that the idea of having, as Travis would say, transportation is available as running water. You didn't have to schedule a shower, and why did you have to schedule a car? So kind of the adherence to that mission and the passion behind it, and the idea that we were making riders' lives better, and we were making drivers' lives better. I mean, we would have thousands of drivers that would come, with us to support whatever initiative to try to make sure that they had work and available work in a particular area. So I thought that was amazing. And then just setting the backdrop of kind of the things that we were trying to change. Um, I've always seen it as the idea that if, Uber had stopped to ask permission if they could change the way the world moved, that Uber just wouldn't exist. And that's where, so I think sometimes the good and the bad, that sort of would sometimes overlap, because, we would enter into cities and countries where, there was a monopoly. No one had any interest in changing the monopoly that existed. And in fact, we had our people, harassed and literally put pictures in Italy of the woman who ran Italy, a picture of her put on a stake and burned, and her phone number and her, home address posted all over town,
Wow.
with threats, with death threats. I mean, it was, the kind of craziness, literally just dealing. I mean, literally dealing with the mob. The very first day I was there, at a introducing Uber for Business at a travel conference, and we were introducing Uber for Business, and there were three really big guys from New Jersey sitting in the front row. Yeah, and I got done, and they came up, and they're like, "We need to talk." And I'm like,
Wow.
"Okay, okay." So, I think which we could talk about the other side of the coin. There was a sense of urgency, which was incredibly positive. And then there was a sense of an aggressiveness, in making things happen that would not, but for taking that sense of aggressiveness, the company and the whole change and really rideshare overall just wouldn't exist.
So if you think of, I love those things. I love drive and smart, intelligent people who have a passion and a incredible ability to execute. And I really don't have if you're going to disrupt an industry, there's nothing wrong with an apology rather than permission.
Yeah.
And I love the sense of urgency. Could you have accomplished all that culturally without being mean to each other internally? With the, as Professor Sutton from Stanford says, the no asshole rule. Could you have done both of those things?
It's tough. I mean, honestly, and I don't say this and like, oh, everyone should be assholes to each other internally. Like, no, right? I mean, there's definitely a way to deal. And I think some of the founding principles that were just interpreted in not such a great way, right? So one of the other principles we had, we called it, or it was sort of called toe stepping. And the idea of it was you always seek the truth. Like you go for the right answer. And it's not about hierarchy. It's not about, staying quiet and like, oh, that's a terrible idea. And I think that's really bad. And I'm just going to try to like sabotage it later because I think it's dumb. Like the idea is saying, wait, does that make sense? And let's hash it out right now. And a lot of times that leads to conflict. I think that we had some challenges from a cultural perspective from that. Those things got interpreted sometimes as like he who yells the loudest wins. And that can be very challenging in an organization, or the idea of sort of people, there's definitely some from a political perspective of people, pitting against each other until they, sort of fight it out to figure out, kind of which direction things were going to go in. But I think that the principles underlying it, the reasons why, the idea of sort of what we say fierce truth seeking, were positive things. But when they're a lot of times framed in a manner that feels sort of aggressive, then that ends up hampering things, certainly from a cultural perspective overall.
Amy, thank you for kind of sharing your story and perspective with us. I'm kind of curious, you were in that culture. Did that competitiveness, did it motivate you to be a high achiever, or did you eventually get burned out on it?
Yes and yes, right? I think there was something, and look, I mean, and I do believe, and as I look to, at what I do going forward, there was definitely that culture of a lot of fear, and I don't know that's not a positive thing, right? It's certainly motivating and very motivating in a short-term way, but two people do get burnt out, and you sort of say, like, to use the basketball term, people don't play loose quite as much. So I do think that, no question, the desire to do great and be competitive and to win in that way is a super positive thing. But there were also plenty of times personally where I was like, wow, like my personality is not that way. I mean, I'm positive, I'm competitive, and I want to do well, and I want to lead teams to perform. But I'm a generally positive person versus doing that in a lead through fear perspective. And sometimes it was actually very, very challenging, both less so in how I led my teams, but more so in feeling like it was not the norm. And I think it was just very, there were, times it was wonderful and like, this is the greatest place I've ever been. And I still, in retrospect, will say that it was probably, I mean, I don't know what's ahead of me, but the greatest professional experience of my life to date in building Uber and working in that environment and team. But it was also the most challenging environment that I've ever been in. And there were definitely times where it was the culture side and that feeling like you were getting, the shit kicked out of you all the time, that made it like, wow, I don't know if I can really do this anymore. But, so I think there is, certainly as I look forward into everything that I do next, like I certainly believe in high standards for people and for being an owner, not a renter, and for looking to find the truth and not just, going along with something because it's somebody's boss, right? You want to try to get to the best answers because that's what builds the best products and the best companies. But I believe in doing that in a positive way, in more of carrots than sticks, I would say. And I think we were probably more focused on the sticks than the carrots.
So, did you have a sort of a different subculture within your team that was a little different than the overall Uber culture?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I don't know that it was. I mean, I worked a lot across the company overall. I spent a lot of time running, national and global campaigns so I had my team, and then we had a kind of dotted line matrix to larger teams, and then we would run certain things that would, you'd be, having, hundreds or thousands of people, right, leading and kind of creating something, which again was one of those things that we could turn on. I could turn on a global program in, in months, right, and execute it in such an immediate time, even faster. I mean, we could do it very quickly. But some of the big programs that we ran on a global basis, so I definitely was always, I think, you have to ask my teams, but I pretty much know that's the case, as a very positive leader. And as long as that positivity, right, gets results, then that all works out extremely well.
So we were talking about subculture, but let me jump to another question. I think it was after the IPO, they brought in a new leader, Dara, and I'm not going to even attempt the last name. And they brought in other people who were supposed to fix the culture. And I guess I'll ask a two-part question. One part is, do you even think the culture was broken? And two, how do you think the effort to fix it went?
Yeah. So I would say, so Dara actually came in, it was before the IPO. It was probably maybe, God, I'm trying to remember. I think Travis left, maybe it was ended up being a year before. And Dara, we had a period of time that we had no CEO. And then Dara ended up coming in, who was great. So was it broken? Yes, it was. It had gotten to a point over many years where it had devolved, where some of the intensity, the aggressiveness, and the challenges that we had in sort of a lot of fear-based leadership started to show the cracks. And you had people who were dissatisfied. We had a ton of leaks that were happening. Like one of the things that I loved about the company early on is that we were pretty close to the outside, but we were extremely open internally with everyone. Like there was no, on a need to know basis. Like we were very transparent as an organization, and it was wonderful because you always knew what we were working on and what the goals were and what needed to be fixed. And then as time went on, as people became dissatisfied with the way the culture had operated, and as we continued to grow, um, then we started having leaks. We started had, our all company meetings were being, we joked at one point, but it was true. Like Mike Isaacs in the New York Times was live tweeting our meetings. I mean, it was like everything started to fall in, to have challenges in those parts. So I do think there were parts of it that were definitely broken. Um, and then when Dara came in, there was definitely moves to fix it even before Dara and to try to move it into a kind of a different phase of the company. Um, and I do think that overall it has been effective. I said I left about a year ago, and there was definitely changes with respect to the way that people were treated and the company operated. But also I think we've had not a full turnover of new people, but a lot of the people that were there to sort of build originally, the 1.0s, have kind of been replaced, and with us, another amazing group of people that are kind of taking the company through into the next stage. So I think, yes, it was broken by the time that Travis left and that Dara came in. And I think that Dara has really done an excellent job on trying to put the culture in the right place. And particularly, the one big mantra of his, as soon as he came in and we kind of reworked the cultural values, was do the right thing. And I think that having that very simple statement of do the right thing was a very positive move for Uber.
Yeah, it sounds like the culture that was put in place and the set of values that drove that culture initially is what was required to disrupt a entrenched industry protected by powerful people from New Jersey. And but because that culture was a little bit like a tiger by the tail, and you had to really watch it, otherwise it might get away from you and devolve, which sounds like that's what happened. But on the bright side, it can be nurtured again and fixed, and it's great that that's what's happening. So a lot of good stuff we learned today. I really appreciate your time today, Amy. Caroline, anything you want to add?
All I have to add is just thank you, Amy. I think I've really appreciated hearing your story, and I think it gives us a lot of perspective around what really happened and kind of, like Greg said, what it takes to really disrupt an industry. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I appreciate it. It was great talking to you both.
Well, that was fun. I'm going back to the original quote, the hook at the beginning of this episode, Caroline, when you said, "Don't fuck up the culture," which is what Peter Thiel, the famous venture capitalist, said to Airbnb when they first made an investment in that company. And perhaps the lesson here is that be deliberative about your culture. Pick the kind of culture you want, whether it's the no asshole rule or not, whether it's a team focused or individual performance or not, but then don't screw it up. Well, maybe that's the key. So I think maybe now that we've heard from a viewpoint of someone who lived in an industry, maybe we could talk to an academic expert about these topics. Let's bring in Julie Manning Magid, who is a professor at IU, which you referenced at the top of the podcast. She's also the executive and academic director of the Randall L. Tobias Center for Leadership Excellence at Indiana University. And Julie can help us think about good and bad cultures, whether it is so simple as to define culture as either being good or bad. Was Uber a bad culture or just a different culture? Let's see what Julie has to say about that. We're really pleased to have you with us, Julie.
Thank you for having me.
So, Julie, what we're talking about today is the cost of a bad culture. And we can look at a couple different metrics. Perhaps it's financial metrics. Perhaps it's employee retention. And then sort of a related question is there such thing as a bad culture? And the case study that we discussed on this podcast is Uber. In some ways, maybe you could read the news and say, well, they had some cultural issues. But in other ways, could they have achieved such disruption without having such an aggressive and driving culture? So, Julie, we'd love to get your thoughts on is there a good or bad culture, and what metrics should we measure, and if you have any thoughts on any kind of case study, Uber, Lululemon, Bon Appetit, all the things we've read in the news, we'd love to hear about it.
First of all, I would like to point out that it's not just a new disruptive industry type culture that can lead to problems, right? So you have the case a few years back of Bluebell ice cream. Bluebell is sort of like Lululemon in terms of a cult-like fascination, devotion to the product, when it was announced that Bluebell had a listeria outbreak. It was, many of their customers were more concerned about not being able to get Bluebell ice cream than being concerned about possibly being sick with listeria. So that really, that speaks to that sort of cult-like consumer base that so many brands strive for. And Bluebell was a very different company culture than an Uber, in that it was family owned, more traditionally hierarchical, and did not embrace this high risk behavior that an Uber did. Nonetheless, both had significant problems that many can point back to tone at the top culture. For Bluebell, it became this listeria outbreak that cost in terms of lawsuits. And for Uber, it was an IPO that was a disappointing release. And, now they have all sorts of class action lawsuits going on. Now, I think the pandemic probably also contributed to some issues around Uber and their drivers that were unexpected. So I think it's important at the outset to note that it's not a culture that does not promote positive discussions and embracing difficult issues is not one or the other. It's not because we are high risk embracing or that we're traditional and that we tend to close ranks when problems occur. It can happen in both cultures, which I think is one of the interesting and sort of head scratching issues about how to create a positive culture.
So I'm happy that you kind of hit on that. Greg and I are actually in the middle of learning about just different personality types, another initiative that we're just working on internally. And I wonder, do you think that has something to do with it? Today I learned, I have a very driving personality type, and I think to some extent a competitive nature would motivate me. But is there something inherently about like a hyper competitive culture that would, you know, cause people to be turned off by the company, or does it kind of just depend on the person? Or what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that a hyper competitive culture in and of itself is not a bad thing. I think that what research has shown us is no matter if it's a hyper competitive driven culture or a more traditional hierarchical culture, there has to be room for people to express when integrity issues have arisen, when the group is not meeting the requirements of law, first and foremost, or ethics in a way that will allow the organization to sustain itself, right? So that's really where these cultural issues get into trouble in terms of comfortable and non-challenging and not driven. But what it means is, can you act like you naturally would, or instead, are you looking around you all the time for clues about how you should act? And when you're busy taking in clues for how you should act from people around you, you are not willing to speak out and speak up about potentially damaging developments within the organization. And that's where things run afoul, no matter what your underlying culture is.
Julie, what you just described, looking over your shoulder and trying to take cues on how you should behave, to me sounds really exhausting, and I don't know how long I'd be able to be happy or productive in an environment like that. And so from what you've told us, obviously we can measure, are there legal issues? Are there ethical issues? Is there bad PR? I'm wondering though, Julie, do you think there are any metrics that are more leading than those things? So that if we find our way moving from a strong culture, but it's weakening and on a road to these things, are there leading metrics? I'm thinking retention would be one, but maybe there are others.
Retention is a great example. And if people are leaving, making sure you have those conversations to understand why they're leaving. But let's face it, most places don't get, honest answers, even in exit interviews. It's really only in very bad exits where people are really willing to be completely honest, because everyone wants to protect those bridges that have been built. I think that it is effective to think about regular internal audits to address behaviors that may show some impairment in organizational integrity. And that's how I would think about, there's a lot of organizational integrity literature out there, but that's more how I think about when you're discussing how do we know if people are afraid to speak up. And you're right, it is exhausting on people. You can look at sick days that people are taking and get an indicator of whether something wrong is happening in your organization. Because if people need more time away, then it's too exhausting to actually be at the workplace. So those sort of internal audits about organizational integrity are really helpful to understand if there is some hypocrisy that exists between what the organization is saying they are doing and what people perceive is what they can do in a workplace. And one of those things is understanding whether everyone is clear on the purpose of your organization, the goals, and the clear path to get there. That's what people want in a culture, to feel part of a team, if you will. And part of unveiling whether there is a culture that is being felt in a positive way, so we don't always have to look at negative metrics, is everyone speaking from the same playbook, to continue my team metaphor? Does everyone cite the same purpose, the same path? And that can be more than, how many products we're going to sell. People want to have a higher purpose for why they're trying to sell these products.
Julie, I think the goal for most companies is probably to never get to a point where the culture is broken, and to be able to facilitate this healthy culture where people feel empowered and able to speak up. But when you do get to a point like Uber did, they've poured a lot of money into trying to fix it. And I think we're kind of seeing currently if that's going to play out or if they're going to have to continue working at it. Is this something you can fix once your culture gets to such a broken point? Or do you kind of just have to start over?
That's a great question. And I think it's possible to fix, but I think it has to come from a perspective that is not, we are fixing this for a PR boost or even a employee retention perspective. It has to come from a place where we believe that a culture where people ask difficult questions while remaining professional and collegial, where people are comfortable to speak up and have a range of opinions. What we know is that there are lots of good reasons for organizations to embrace the idea of people expressing different opinions in teams. And the bottom line is why that's good for organizations is you get better results. When people do not make quick decisions in a groupthink kind of way, and when people stop to consider all the different perspectives of a more diverse team who are speaking up with different perspectives, it does slow down decision making, but the resulting decisions are better. And so if we believe that you want good decisions made in your organization, then culture of embracing, again, in a professional, collegial way, but speaking up and offering different perspectives is great for business. That's what you want. So I think that organizations can fix culture as long as they have, embraced the belief that that's how better decisions are going to be driven.
Julie, you gave us a lot to chew on, and we really appreciate your perspective and your time. I personally felt that I'm interested in the concept of internal audits to make sure that we understand our intent and how that's actually showing up or being perceived by the employee base. I like that idea a lot. And I also like the reassurance you gave us that you can have a competitive or hard driving or results focused culture and still abide by what Professor Sutton calls the no asshole rule, and still abide by legal and ethical standards. So that's sort of the balance we're always trying to strike. Is there anything you'd like our listeners to know about the Tobias Center, or anything else you'd like to mention before we part ways?
The Tobias Fellows Program is one of our best programs for bringing that research and practice to experienced executives. So we are recruiting now for our 16th class that will start in 2021. So if you have experienced executives who can really embrace this leadership development program, I encourage people to reach out to us.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for all that you do at the Tobias Center, the efforts and the programs that you undertake. The entire community of businesses and the ecosystem in Central Indiana benefits. So we appreciate it, and thank you for your time.
Thank you both. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Caroline, before I get to the closing of this podcast, I want to just say we're on our third episode, and I'm having a lot of fun, and I feel like we're learning a lot, and I'm looking forward to taking a lot of what we learned and having a positive impact at our company, which is super fun. And I hope that our listeners also are enjoying it and learning a lot, and ideally taking some of what they've learned to make a positive impact at their own company. So that would be wonderful. So Caroline, what did we learn today?
I think the big takeaway today was just that nurturing a strong culture is a sound business decision. These are not things that work against each other. They're things that work very well with each other. And also, it's much easier to nurture a culture on the front end than to fix it on the back end. We saw with Uber, the costs to fix a broken culture are real, and they're high, and they're long-term, and if we're being honest, we're not sure if it's been fixed yet. So I guess that's an ongoing journey for them. But I mean, at the end of the day, who wants to work with a bunch of unhappy and mean people? Why not nurture that culture where we can all walk in and feel like we belong and enjoy showing up to work?
Yeah, for us, I think we're striking a balance where we want to nurture our employees and achievement at any cost is not okay.
I would agree.
Awesome.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. You can find more information about us and all of our episodes on our website, archimed.com. You'll find us under the What's New tab. On our next episode, we will discuss employee happiness and engagement. What is the company's role and responsibility in employee happiness and engagement? We will be joined by Beth Trammell from the Department of Psychology at Indiana University East. See you next time.